ever feel like getting your audience to really connect with you is like this big mystery? You know, you put so much into an episode and dot nothing, but then you listen to another podcast and you're instantly hooked. And you're like, what are they doing that I'm not?
It's so true.
So today we're doing a deep dive into your episode, Mastering Audience Connection, to figure out just that.
Yeah. And it's funny, right? Even though it's audio only,
Mm-hmm.
that connection, that human element, it's everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about being a perfectly polished broadcaster.
Right, right.
It's about something much more, you know, raw and real.
Okay, so let's unpack that. One thing that really struck me was this idea of using your real voice, not some kind of put-on podcaster voice,
Yeah.
but the voice you use when you're just chatting with a friend.
Exactly.
Mm.
And they actually gave that example, the one where they talk about that podcaster who had this surprisingly high voice,
Yeah.
talking about making candles, of all things.
Yeah.
And it totally worked because it was so authentically them.
Right.
It's like those little quirks, those unexpected things,
Yeah.
they actually draw people in because they break that kind of illusion of the perfectly produced show, right?
Totally. It's funny because it reminds me of this podcast I was listening to about history, and the host had this laugh. It was contagious. And every time they found something funny, I would just find myself chuckling along with them.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made, learning about history so much more, enjoyable.
And that's what's so interesting, right? We're so conditioned to go for this perfection, to edit out all the imperfections.
Yeah.
But those are the things, those little flaws
Yeah.
that actually make us relatable.
Totally. And speaking of things we try to edit out, they made this point about pauses,
Yeah.
which I don't know about you, but I'm always trying to avoid those. But apparently they're actually really important
They're huge.
for creating a more natural rhythm.
It's like the difference between reading a textbook,
Right.
right?
Right.
And having a conversation. In real life, we pause,
Yeah.
we breathe, we take those moments to think, and it makes us sound less like robots.
Yeah.
More like we're actually, engaging with what we're saying.
It's like giving your listener time to, catch their breath, process what they just heard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about respecting their time,
Yeah.
respecting their attention. Now, one thing I found interesting was this idea of listening to an invisible audience,
Yeah.
which sounds kind of mystical, right?
It does sound kind of mystical.
But it's really about tapping into those universal experiences and emotions that go beyond just like the limitations of the medium.
Right, because you're trying to connect with someone you can't see,
Right.
can't hear, which is essentially the challenge of podcasting when you think about it.
Exactly.
And they actually gave the example of the host who got locked out in a thunderstorm,
Oh, yeah.
which I thought was so relatable.
Because we've all been there.
Right.
Not necessarily locked out in a thunderstorm,
Right.
but that feeling of unexpected chaos. And when you share those experiences, even through a microphone, that's where the connection happens.
Yeah, it makes you feel less alone. Like, oh, they're human too.
Exactly. Exactly. Those moments of vulnerability, right?
It reminds me, one time I accidentally hit publish on an episode that was totally half finished.
Oh, no.
Oh, I was mortified. But you know what? Some of the feedback I got was like, I'm glad I'm not the only one who messes up sometimes.
Exactly. It makes you relatable. They know you're human, just like them. And that is huge. But okay, moving on. Another takeaway was, well, stories.
Right.
Which, I mean, it seems obvious. Stories are engaging. But it really drives home how important they are, especially for making information stick.
Yeah, because I'm definitely more likely to remember a point if it's woven into some kind of, interesting story.
Exactly. Our brains are hardwired for stories. Like, think about that example they gave about the cat jumping off the counter.
Right.
It's not exactly breaking news,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the way it's told, the emotion behind it. That's what makes it memorable.
It's like, facts tell, stories sell. A good story can make even like the most complicated information way more interesting.
Totally. It's like slipping those facts into a nice little narrative burrito.
Right.
People, they might not remember all the dates, all the stats, but they'll remember that feeling they had when they heard the story.
Right. And speaking of feelings, there's a lot in here about authenticity, which always feels a little buzzwordy to me,
Right. Like, what does that actually mean in podcasting?
Yeah, exactly.
It means you resist that urge to be someone you're not, right? To overproduce, to sound like a robot reading a script. Remember that story about the host who spent forever perfecting an episode and it totally flopped?
Oh, yeah, the one where they thought they had like a viral hit.
Exactly. And it turned out listeners thought it was just, well, sterile.
Because it lacked that human element.
Yeah, it's those little stumbles, those off-the-cuff comments where you could just, I don't know, hear their personality. That's what people crave.
It's like we can sense when someone's being fake, even through a microphone. We want that realness.
Right. It's like, imagine you're at a party
Yeah.
and you meet someone who is perfectly polished, says all the right things.
But you're just kind of like waiting for them to let their guard down.
Exactly. To see the real person underneath it all.
Yeah.
And podcasting, it's the same thing. Listeners, they want to connect with you, not some fake, perfect version of you.
Okay, so how do we find that balance then between, being professional, putting out good content, but also being ourselves?
Well, I think it's about being aware of who you're talking to, of course, but then giving yourself permission to, be human. Let those mistakes happen.
Yeah.
It's okay to laugh at yourself, to go off on a tangent sometimes, as long as it feels true to you and still connects with what your listeners care about.
So it's like finding that sweet spot where your personality and your content just kind of, I don't know, come together in a way that feels genuine.
Exactly.
Now, one thing that kept coming up was this whole idea of like treating your podcast like a conversation.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because that's kind of what it is, right?
At its heart, it's you having a conversation with your listeners.
Even if you can't see them.
Right. And even though it's one-sided in a way, it doesn't mean it can't feel conversational. You want that sense of intimacy, of a shared experience. Think about how you talk with your close friends. There are always tangents, inside jokes, those little moments where you're both on the same page.
It's like you're inviting them over to just hang out and chat, even if they're, on a walk or driving to work.
Yeah. It's such a powerful thing.
Yeah.
Because it feels like in a world that can be so isolating, this is a way to actually connect.
It's so true. Sometimes I'll be listening to a podcast and it's like I'm just hanging out with friends.
Exactly. That's what's so great about it, right?
Yeah.
It strips away all the pretense. It's just you being you. And when you let that happen, when you're not afraid to be your authentic self,
Yeah.
that's where the real magic happens.
It's like we thought we needed the fancy equipment and the perfect editing and all that.
Right.
But maybe it's way simpler.
Maybe it's just remembering that we're all just people.
Yeah.
Trying to connect with other people.
Yeah.
Sharing our stories.
And at the end of the day, isn't that what really matters? So for everyone listening, as you keep working on your podcasts, think about how you can bring more of your own personality to the table. Don't be afraid to experiment a little. Try new things. Most importantly, have fun with it. Because when you're passionate about what you're doing, that comes through. And who knows, you might just find that the most authentic version of you is also the most engaging.